Chuck Norris wasn't a man who needed an introduction, but when he stepped into Nusr-Et Steakhouse that evening, it was as if the entire universe instinctively bowed its head in acknowledgement. The heavy oak doors swung open with a gentle groan, and a warm gust of spice-laden air wrapped around him like a welcoming shawl. Conversations across the dining room stalled mid-sentence. Utensils froze halfway to mouths, and all eyes turned toward the doorway, as if drawn by an invisible magnetic force. Wearing a simple black button-up shirt, jeans, and a pair of worn leather boots, Chuck moved through the entrance with the relaxed certainty of a man who had tamed wild stallions before breakfast. The maitre d', a slim man in an impeccably tailored suit, nearly tripped over his own polished shoes, rushing forward to greet him. His rehearsed smile faltered into genuine awe as he bowed and ushered Chuck toward a special table, one reserved only for the most revered of guests, a polished slab of walnut positioned to command a perfect view of the open kitchen. As Chuck settled into the plush leather seat, guests leaned subtly across their tables, whispering excitedly behind menus and wine glasses. Phones were discreetly lifted, some under the pretense of checking messages, but many hoping to catch even a blurred photo of the living legend. Chuck, unfazed, scanned the room with a calm intensity that made even the bravest of onlookers drop their gazes in respect. In the kitchen, cooks nudged each other and poked their heads around swinging doors to steal a glimpse. A palpable, electrifying tension hung in the air like the final note of a symphony suspended just before resolution. Assigned to serve him was a waiter named Julian, a new hire, barely 3 weeks into the job. Tall and lanky with a shock of curly brown hair, Julian had been desperate to impress his bosses. Tonight was supposed to be his moment. He had practiced the signature salt sprinkle move, the legendary flourish popularized by Salt Bae himself, in front of a mirror for hours, his fingers tracing elegant arcs through imaginary crystals of salt. But no practice, no YouTube tutorial, and certainly no employee handbook had prepared him for the reality of standing 3 feet away from Chuck Norris. Julian balanced a golden tomahawk steak on a massive silver tray, his palms sweating profusely despite the cool air conditioning. He could feel every pair of eyes in the restaurant drilling into him, their expectations weighing as heavily as the tray itself. His throat tightened. His heartbeat thudded loudly against his ribs, echoing in his ears like distant war drums. As he approached Chuck's table, he cleared his throat and attempted a confident smile, but it emerged more like a grimace. Chuck looked up at him with those steely blue eyes that had stared down grizzly bears and made them reconsider their life choices, and nodded almost imperceptibly. It was the signal. Julian placed the tray on the stand with a clumsy thunk and grabbed the ornate salt bowl. He inhaled sharply. "You can do this," he told himself. "It's just salt. Just salt." Raising his arm high in the air in the exaggerated, theatrical pose that Salt Bae had made famous, Julian prepared to let the salt tumble through his fingers in a dazzling shower over the glistening steak. Time seemed to slow down. Every patron, every staff member, every atom in the room held its breath. Then disaster struck. His sweaty fingers betrayed him. As he pinched the salt and released, instead of a controlled trickle over the meat, a rogue clump of salt broke loose, bypassed the steak entirely, and landed directly on Chuck Norris's head with an almost comical pft. The salt crystals glittered against Chuck's hair like rebellious snowflakes, each tiny grain seemingly vibrating with terror. The room went silent. Not silent in the normal sense, but in the apocalyptic end-of-time sense. It was as if sound itself had been stunned into submission. Julian's eyes widened in horror. His mouth opened in a silent scream. The tray clattered to the ground, forgotten. Somewhere to the right, a diner dropped her glass of wine, the deep red liquid pooling on the floor like spilled blood. A little boy near the window let his ice cream cone tumble from his hand, the cold scoop splattering pathetically onto his sneakers. Chuck Norris didn't move. Not immediately. He sat there, salt-laden, the only living statue in a room full of quivering souls. Slowly, deliberately, He lifted a hand and brushed the salt from his shoulder with a single smooth sweep, as if erasing an insult with the grace of a samurai wiping blood from his blade. The motion was so fluid, so effortless, that it was almost beautiful. Julian collapsed onto one knee, his hands clasped in front of him in a posture of pure, desperate apology. His voice cracked as he tried to speak, but no words came out, only a pathetic, rasping whimper. The kitchen staff ducked behind the counters, shielding their heads, expecting a catastrophic roundhouse kick that would level the building. The manager, a portly man with a shiny forehead and a tie too tight around his neck, sprinted across the floor, panting heavily, ready to intervene but powerless to stop the inevitable. Chuck leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the table's edge. His gaze bore into Julian with a force that could have melted steel. Guests braced themselves, their muscles tensed, their instincts screaming at them to flee, but their curiosity rooting them in place. Chuck's hand shifted, not into a fist, but onto the handle of his steak knife. A collective gasp shuddered through the crowd. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for judgment. Instead, Chuck calmly sliced into the tomahawk steak, the blade whispering through the tender meat like a hot knife through butter. He lifted a piece to his mouth, chewed thoughtfully, and gave his slightest nod, a motion so subtle yet so definitive that the entire restaurant seemed to exhale in relief. It was a moment of pure mercy, one that would later become the stuff of legend, recounted by staff and customers alike as the night Chuck Norris chose peace over annihilation. Julian opened his eyes slowly, tears streaking his flushed face. Chuck motioned for him to rise with a simple flick of his wrist. Overwhelmed, Julian stood shakily, bowing again and again, his body language a portrait of abject gratitude. The dining room gradually returned to life. Conversations resumed, albeit in hushed, reverent tones. Glasses clinked cautiously. Forks moved with tentative purpose. Yet, every few minutes, diners would glance nervously back at Chuck's table, as if confirming he was still there and not launching into an interdimensional fistfight. Julian disappeared into the kitchen, where he was immediately mobbed by sympathetic co-workers who hugged him, slapped his back, and in one case, kissed him full on the forehead in pure relief. Chuck, meanwhile, ate his steak in peace, savoring each bite with the unhurried satisfaction of a man who understood that time itself waited for him. But just as the atmosphere began to settle, as the restaurant started to believe they had survived the night, the double doors at the entrance swung open with a theatrical flourish. In strode a figure so iconic that even Chuck himself paused mid-bite. Wearing dark aviator sunglasses despite the indoor lighting, a tight white t-shirt stretched across his well-toned chest, and a gold watch glinting on his wrist, Salt Bae, Nusr-Et, entered the scene like a matador stepping into an arena. He adjusted his cuffs with the casual arrogance of a man used to commanding rooms simply by existing. His smirk widened slightly as he surveyed the room. He had seen everything. The true showdown had only just begun. Salt Bae didn't walk into Nusr-Et. He arrived. His very presence seemed to bend the light around him, casting a golden aura that made even the crystal chandeliers blink in admiration. His every step was a calculated performance, the confident gait of a man who had sprinkled salt for presidents, pop stars, and billionaires. The room fell silent once again, but this time it wasn't fear that held everyone in place. It was pure, slack-jawed fascination. Phones snapped up instantly, dozens of red record buttons blinking like anxious little hearts. Chuck Norris, chewing methodically, paused mid-bite to lift his eyes toward the newcomer. Their gazes locked across the room, a silent exchange that felt less like an introduction and more like a prelude to something cosmic. Salt Bae's smirk twitched upward by a fraction, a challenge disguised as a smile. Chuck simply raised one eyebrow, a subtle warning that he was not here for theatrics. Undeterred, Salt Bae moved through the restaurant with the fluid grace of a dancer, pausing at select tables to flash his signature finger snap, his small bow, the quick, knowing glance that promised patrons a story they'd tell for years. Servers and kitchen staff parted for him like the Red Sea, and even the manager, still trembling from the earlier Salt incident, plastered on a desperate grin and gestured toward Chuck's table as if offering up a sacred tribute. Salt Bae approached slowly, his every movement oozing showmanship. His hands, the famous hands insured for millions, were already at work, one holding a small mountain of artisanal sea salt, the other tucked casually behind his back like a fencer preparing for a duel. He came to a dramatic halt 3 feet from Chuck Norris, the distance just close enough to engage, just far enough to avoid a tactical response. The entire restaurant seemed to lean in collectively. Without breaking eye contact, Salt Bae spun in a half circle, snapped his fingers with a pop so crisp it sounded like a gunshot, and reached into the air to pluck an invisible something. A gesture that in lesser hands would have looked ridiculous, but here somehow felt like conjuring magic. With a grand, exaggerated flair, he grabbed a fresh steak from a server, balanced it on the back of his hand, and let it slide onto a sizzling hot plate in front of Chuck. The meat hissed dramatically as it met the iron, sending up a fragrant plume of smoke. It was a performance worthy of Broadway, a masterclass in culinary drama. Patrons clapped softly, some in awe, others desperate not to anger the stern figure sitting at the center of it all. Chuck, however, didn't clap. He didn't even blink. He simply leaned back slightly, one hand resting lazily on the table, the other still holding his knife like a king holding court. His eyes, sharp and analytical, seemed to see through the performance, through the man, through everything. Salt Bae hesitated, just a microsecond, but it was enough. For a performer so attuned to the rhythm of attention, Chuck's deadpan stillness was like a skipped beat in a symphony. Nevertheless, Salt Bae pushed onward. He struck his legendary pose, the elbow bent high, the wrist cocked just so, his fingers poised in a delicate curve. A few feet away, a woman audibly gasped as if witnessing a Michelangelo carved marble. Salt Bae let the salt tumble from his fingers, his arms slicing the air with a peacock's pride. But as the glittering grains floated downward, time stretched long enough for everyone to realize something critical. Chuck Norris didn't move to admire it, didn't lean in, didn't even acknowledge it. Instead, Chuck slowly, almost disdainfully, shifted his steak knife from his right hand to his left and continued eating his first steak, calmly, methodically, as if Salt Bae weren't even there. The silence turned heavy, awkward, pressing against the walls of the restaurant. Salt Bae, who had seasoned steaks for royalty and athletes alike, faltered. His fingers twitched as the last crystals of salt fell in a pitiful little heap on the plate, nowhere near the sizzling center. Julian, peeking from behind a pillar in the kitchen, winced so hard it looked painful. Undeterred, or perhaps too committed to his image to retreat, Salt Bae performed a flourish with the salt bowl, tossing it into the air and catching it behind his back. A few polite claps trickled through the audience, desperate to fill the growing void. Chuck Norris finished his bite. He placed his knife gently down onto the table with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot in the tense room. Then, with glacial calm, Chuck lifted his steely gaze to Salt Bae and spoke for the first time all evening. "Are you done?" he asked, his voice low and steady, the vocal equivalent of a slow-rolling avalanche. The room collectively gasped again, but this time not out of admiration, not out of fear of Chuck's wrath, but out of sheer, stunned respect for the succinct, devastating dismissal. Salt Bae froze mid-pose, his usually immaculate confidence wilting like a flower in a drought. For a full 3 seconds he stood there, a living statue of embarrassment, before he dropped his arms and nodded sheepishly. "Yes, Mr. Norris," he said, voice quieter than anyone had ever heard from him before. Chuck didn't respond. He simply returned to his steak with the same clinical precision he might have used to rebuild a carburetor blindfolded. Salt Bae backed away, his movements now lacking their usual flamboyance. He retreated to the kitchen, sunglasses slipping slightly down his nose, the sheen of sweat visible even under the cool restaurant lighting. The diners watched him go with a mixture of awe and second-hand embarrassment, whispering furiously behind their napkins. Salt Bae, the Sultan of Salt, the master of meat, had just been unceremoniously deposed in a battle of wills by a man whose calm was mightier than any spectacle. Chuck Norris, meanwhile, continued eating in total peace, utterly unaffected by the storm he had just weathered without lifting so much as an eyebrow. And somewhere in the back of the restaurant, Julian quietly whispered, "Legend." But fate wasn't finished with Nusr-Et that night. Far from it, because while Salt Bae might have backed off, bruised but breathing, someone else had been watching from the VIP room upstairs. Someone who was about to step into the ring. For a few precious minutes after Salt Bae's retreat, the restaurant breathed easier. The clink of cutlery, the soft murmur of conversation, and the occasional clatter of plates returned like hesitant soldiers venturing back onto a battlefield after the cannons had fallen silent. Chuck Norris, the undisputed apex predator of calm, finished his steak at an unhurried pace, his expression giving away nothing. Servers tiptoed past his table, practically bowing with each step, terrified of disturbing the fragile peace. Julian remained half-hidden behind the bar, still processing the fact that he had dumped salt on Chuck Norris and survived with all his limbs intact. Meanwhile, Salt Bae sat in the open kitchen, head bowed slightly over cappuccino he wasn't drinking, sunglasses pushed up onto his forehead. His legendary aura had dimmed, the golden glow around him now tarnished with humility. But something else was brewing. Upstairs, in the private VIP room, hidden behind a frosted glass wall, a figure shifted. A figure who had been quietly observing the drama unfold like a king surveying gladiators in his arena. A figure whose identity would soon blow the roof off Nusr-Et and take an already mythic night to a level no one had dared imagine. The glass door swung open with a casual push, and the figure descended the stairs. At first, only a few diners noticed, but those who did fell into stunned silence. They elbowed their companions, who turned and gasped, setting off a chain reaction of disbelief that spread faster than wildfire. Even Salt Bae glanced up sharply, nearly dropping his spoon into his cappuccino. Descending with the swagger of a man who had seen it all and worn better shoes while doing it was none other than Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Clad in a fitted gray t-shirt that looked ready to burst over his biceps, and a grin so wide it could have lit up Times Square, The Rock strolled into the dining room like it was his living room. His charisma was a physical force, radiating out in waves that made even the chandeliers seem to swing a little closer. Chuck Norris didn't move, but his eyes flicked upward just slightly, the first sign of genuine surprise he'd shown all evening. The Rock stopped a few feet from Chuck's table, flashing that million-dollar smile that had charmed millions, and gave a nod of pure respect. "Evening, Chuck," he said, his voice a rich baritone that rolled through the restaurant. Chuck, ever the minimalist, nodded back. "Rock." It was the kind of greeting that only two titans could exchange. Simple, weighty, absolute. Salt Bae, still sitting at the bar, looked like he had seen a ghost made entirely of muscle. His hands twitched toward the salt bowl, then stopped, as if thinking better of it. The Rock turned to the room, arms spread wide in mock incredulity. "So, I hear there's been some seasoning drama?" The room erupted into nervous laughter. Diners who had been paralyzed with anxiety moments earlier now chuckled, grateful for the levity. Even Julian cracked a shaky smile behind the bar. Not missing a beat, The Rock swaggered up to the nearest empty table, grabbed a handful of salt from a small serving dish, and mimicked Salt Bae's famous pose. Elbow high, wrist bent, fingers pinched. He tilted his head and, with exaggerated theatrical flair, sprinkled the salt straight into his own mouth. The restaurant exploded in laughter. Even the kitchen staff doubled over, banging their fists on counters. Salt Bae gave a weak chuckle, tipping an invisible hat toward The Rock in mock defeat. Chuck Norris, for his part, allowed the corners of his mouth to twitch upwards. Not a smile, exactly, but the kind of micro-expression that, from Chuck Norris, was the emotional equivalent of a standing ovation. The Rock sauntered over to Chuck's table, still chewing dramatically on the salt. "You know," The Rock said between bites, "this stuff's not bad, but it could use a little kick." Chuck didn't miss a beat. He placed his knife down again with that same deliberate click and, with a voice so deadpan it could flatten a souffle, replied, "Careful. That much sodium can make you retain water or a consciousness." The room howled. Salt Bae slumped against the bar, one hand over his heart, as if the wit alone had physically struck him. The Rock laughed, a booming, genuine sound that filled every corner of the restaurant. "That's why you're the man, Chuck." The two legends shared a brief, meaningful nod, warriors acknowledging each other not with fists, but with the mutual respect of those who had nothing to prove. Then, in a completely unplanned, utterly spontaneous moment, The Rock turned to the nearest server and said, "Round of steaks on me, people." The restaurant erupted into cheers, applause, and whistles. Even Salt Bae perked up at that, suddenly back in his element, springing into action to help prepare the feast. The staff buzzed like caffeinated bees, rushing to deliver golden steaks, truffle fries, and fine wine to every table. Within minutes, what had begun as a night of tension and terror had transformed into a full-blown celebration. Chuck Norris finished his meal in peace, leaned back in his chair, and accepted a glass of whiskey from a trembling but grateful Julian. He took a slow sip, savoring it, as if granting the world one more small moment of grace. Meanwhile, The Rock moved from table to table, shaking hands, posing for selfies, and cracking jokes that sent peals of laughter rolling through the room. Salt Bae eventually rejoined the festivities too, throwing salt with renewed vigor, but this time more humbly, more human. Hours later, as Chuck Norris finally stood to leave, the restaurant fell silent one last time. He adjusted his belt, gave a brief nod to The Rock, a respectful glance towards Salt Bae, and made his way to the exit. At the door, Chuck paused. He turned his head slightly and, in a voice just loud enough for the entire room to hear, said, "Next time, less salt." With that, he disappeared into the night, leaving behind a restaurant full of people who would tell the story for the rest of their lives. A story of salt, steak, legends, and laughter. And of how, on one unforgettable night, even Salt Bae himself learned that no matter how famous your sprinkle is, you still don't mess with Chuck Norris.